Hi folks and welcome to Breaking Woke, how to identify, debunk and dismantle dangerous ideas. I'm Douglas Kruger, author of the global new book Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. A bit of a departure in terms of format today. Ordinarily, the goal on this channel is to do a short, sharp, succinct debunking of a terrible idea. Today I'd like to zoom back a little and share with you what I believe are the 21 ideological battlefronts that our civilization is facing today. These come from the audio version of the book Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good, and if you are new to this entire challenge that civilization is facing from the woke radical left, then this will be an excellent scene setter for you in terms of perceiving the entire picture. If you are fairly advanced in your knowledge, you will find a great deal of detail within each of the ideological battlefronts. I will also point out counterexamples, and I will help you to debunk those bad ideas as we go. Some of the battlefronts are exactly what you might expect. Big tech and press freedom are perhaps the issues of the day. But there are 20 others, some of which are perhaps a little more obscure than you might have considered before. All of which, however, play their part in the greater battle for our culture. Where are the battle lines drawn today? The goals of political correctness have not changed. They remain an attempt to find meaningfulness and to organize society in a post-God era. Their means of achieving this are largely Marxist, which is to say, they are about leveling and equalizing people. Under political correctness, no one system of values may be seen as superior to any other. As such, a person who says, "I believe in yoga and unicorns," must be viewed as holding a worldview equal to the person who says, "I believe in science." A moral system based on the wishy-washy idea, "I'm spiritual but not religious," which is the same as saying, "I speak but not any particular language," must be viewed as equally valid to the entire Judeo-Christian tradition and its 3,000 years of moral innovations, practice, study, and refinement. So, equalizing and leveling are the goals. Discrediting and discarding the old systems and creating revolutions are the means. The mantra is essentially anything but the old system. We see the practical mechanics and thought policing of this double standard in US schools, where it is okay, and sometimes even compulsory, for children to dress up as Muslims and recite parts of the Quran. But the ACLU immediately and aggressively attacks even the slightest reference to the Judeo-Christian God. And here are the battlefronts. 21 current ideological battlefronts in the war for our culture. 1. Police are bad. Criminals are the noble victims. Christians are bad. The world is oppressed by their irrational superstitious practices. Terrorists are good. They are the understandable oppressed. Sexual deviance is liberation. Abortion is the empowerment of women. Pick an old world value. Everything must be reversed. 2. That man is a woman because he thinks he is. Postmodernism claims that anything can be anything. There are no valid points of reference, no real boundaries, no true definitions. All is relative. All is opinion, and all opinion is true. Science, by contrast, demands categories. Interestingly, so does God. We will get to that. 3. That may be your truth, but this is my truth. In reality, truth must be singular, or it fails to meet its own definition. Anything outside that scope falls under a different category. It is called opinion, and opinions can be factually wrong when compared to verifiable truth. 4. There is no good and bad. There is only power and privilege. It is no longer about who is qualitatively moral or immoral. All humanity must be reclassified according to whether they have power or privilege. The only thing that may be considered morally bad is privilege. The only people who are morally good are those who are oppressed. Hence, it no longer matters whether a superior force is in the right, legally or morally. It only matters that they are a superior force, and by that measure, they become deemed evil. This tactic is most commonly applied to denigrate wealthy white society. It is also often used against the nation of Israel. 5. Gender is relative. You decide which gender you are. In 2019, bowing to pressure from social activists, the World Health Organization declassified gender dysphoria as a mental disorder. This was not based on any change in the science. It was a concession to the weight of public pressure and political correctness. We will examine how profoundly this move, based on feelings over facts, harms real people and especially confused children. 6. What matters is that I'm offended. The promotion of subjective feelings to a position of validity, even primacy, is contra science, contra logic, and contra Western standards, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. However, it makes for a strategically useful slipknot for progressives when facts fail. If feelings are sufficient, then any argument can be won by appeals to imaginary kindness or against imaginary oppression. An excellent example of imaginary oppression is the assertion of invisible racism or systemic racism. You simple folk can't detect it, but we liberal elites can, and we will tell you how to reorder your life and your nation in order to avoid being guilty of it. In both cases, advocates may plead the reality of oppression based on subjective feelings, absent any evidence, and without having to point to where in a system such oppression actually resides. This argument can also be used to defend a bad policy. Our facts may be wrong, but our greater truth is not. 7. Words are violence. Related to the elevation of facts over feeling, in fact dependent on it, the idea that feelings must be prioritized leads to an inevitable next step. Emotionally hurtful words and ideas, which can be so broadly defined as to be absolutely anything, must be forbidden by prescription. These are the practical mechanics of modern censorship in progressive societies. This is how thought policing begins, and how the removal of freedom of conscience is justified. It is as though there are new landmines to be avoided in conversation each day. It is introduced under the ruse of kindness. Absent free speech, there can be no scientific principle. There can also be no standards, for nothing may be debated. Absent free speech, we can simply never arrive at truth. However, by progressive standards, that is precisely the goal. The very idea of truth must be negated, made impossible. 8. Sex is okay with anybody, with anything, at any time. Hashtag love is love. There is no surer way to destroy families, and thus undermine the old moral order, than to promote sex without boundaries and without consequences. It is also the easiest and most successful strategy for destroying societies, because humans have powerful sex drives. A healthy and moderate person may never feel the urge to cheat at gambling or to murder another person. But our sexual urges are hallmarks of good health, and they are so strong that they can be overwhelming. Hence, corrupting them to a purpose is relatively easy. We will examine the profound and far-reaching consequences of societal destruction through free love many times over. In brief, the inevitable results have been fatherless families, which turn out to be the #1 determinant of all forms of crime and moral decay, industrial-level upticks in abortion numbers, decreases in the male sense of accountability, and the total fracture of traditional units of moral transmission. Ironically, desanctification of sex is also responsible for lower levels of sexual satisfaction, not higher levels. Even as it destroys, the trap fails to deliver what it so enticingly promises. Most damningly, we will see that the normalcy of boundaryless sex was sold to society on fraudulent science. I do not place great blame on the shoulders of notorieties like Hugh Hefner. He was just an honest pornographer. By contrast, the scientists who sold us fraudulent claims about human sexuality with society-altering consequences, to my mind, qualify as the greater transgressors. As we progress, we will speak about the fraudulent science and evil deeds of Kinsey and money. 9. I'm triggered. Take me to my safe space. From the year 420 BC, right up to about 2014, universities were supposed to be provocative and challenge students to contest ideas. Then, according to social scientist and author Jonathan Haidt, something changed. Not only did it change, but it quickly became mainstream. Students began to perceive the world not in terms of competing ideas, but in terms of danger and safety. They indulged in a strange combination of extreme fragility and extreme sensitivity. Haidt points out that they were now being taught to think in exactly the way that cognitive behavioral therapists, who are interested in increasing mental strength, teach people not to think. They were catastrophizing. They indulged in black and white thinking. They used overgeneralizations. College, Haidt argues, has somehow switched to actually making students mentally fragile rather than mentally strong. They now promote a fragile to the point of damage call-out culture. Ben Shapiro adds that this is the furthest extension of political correctness, that when you say something, it's not just me disagreeing with you, it is me destroying your identity as a human being in a way that is akin to violence, which, naturally, justifies the left's violence in response to hearing anything they don't like. So, why? Why make weak people? Why use the very institution charged with raising excellent minds to raise fragile and hyper-offended ones, who call for trigger warnings and require counseling after hearing a scary new idea? Because that way, everyone can be a victim. Remember, this entire project is premised on marginalized victims fighting the system. That's why. It proceeds like this. Atheism becomes Marxism. Marxism, reinterpreted by the Frankfurt School, becomes a social theory. The theory is marginalized and disenfranchised groups destroy the system. To be marginalized and disenfranchised, you must perceive yourself to be weak and oppressed. Teach them to be that. Et voila. It creates your foot soldiers, and it justifies your violence. We see this indulgent celebration of personal weakness spilling out into popular society. I am fascinated by the preponderance of everyday talk about healing. When a society constantly talks about healing, it is implying that it is, by definition, perpetually broken, perpetually traumatized, perpetually damaged. I'll never forget one of my friends on social media, a liberal feminist lesbian who works in academia in the United States, posting her reaction the day after Donald Trump was elected to the presidency. She spoke about how now is a time for healing. We must tend to our hurt and try to become whole again beyond this trauma. Healing? Trauma? From the results of a democratic election? Perhaps I was still naive back then, but I couldn't quite understand how those terms could be applied in such a context. Now I do. This personal brokenness is learned. It is codified and taught. I find the prevalence of healing discourse at least slightly troubling, insofar as it plays into the victimhood narrative. You see it down to the subtlest of levels. Today, a social media acquaintance posted about how she was beginning to come to terms with her role as a mother. This was 8 years after the birth of her first child and 6 years after the birth of her second. She wanted both children. Yet the narrative stealthily suggests that she is a victim of motherhood, who is now nobly rising to the occasion. So brave. Call me callous, but I don't see that as a tear-inducing act of overcoming. Being a mother is, at the very least, a duty that you take seriously, having chosen it. You are not a victim. As a parent raising a child myself, I have always believed that passing on competence and ability is the point. Otherwise stated, the point is not to raise a child, but rather to raise an adult. Whenever I ruminate on this topic, I have two thoughts. The first is for people who are trying to heal. All right, then what? Is there a goal on the far side of this healing? Or is healing itself just a lifelong project of encultured self-indulgence? Secondly, I am reminded of the weakened and defenseless Eloi of The Time Machine, and can't help but think there's your path to that outcome. It's worth noting that Jonathan Haidt makes compelling arguments that a recent rise in teenage mental health issues leading to depression and suicidal ideation correspond strongly with the increased use of smart electronic devices, social media, and television viewing. By contrast, it appears that 5 activities have inverse relationships with depression: participating in sports and exercise, attending religious services, reading books, interacting socially in person, doing homework. The best book on this topic, The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. 10. Poverty Made Me Kill Them. Terrorists are recast as victims of oppression, criminals as victims of poverty. Abortionists are somehow victims too, either of the patriarchy or of poverty, or of societal norms, specifically the societal norm of not killing a baby. Across the board, instigators and perpetrators have no part to play in their own acts, their own stories, even their pregnancies, nor any means of preventing these outcomes. They are victims, and abortion is posed as the only solution. No one, it would seem, is responsible for anything. Straight-faced news reporters have even attempted to make the case that terrorism is a result of the West's failure to solve climate change and healthcare issues. No one is responsible for their misdeeds, other than, perhaps, the West. Indeed, left-leaning academics and scientists are increasingly making the case that there is no such thing as free will. This neatly excuses everything, yet begs so many logical questions that it boggles the, apparently not free, mind. For instance, if you tell me that I have no free will and I slap you, can I then counter that I had no choice? However, this same standard pointedly does not apply to the old moral order of Western tradition, which, naturally, is single-handedly to blame for every one of the moral misdeeds plaguing humanity. The end goal of such reasoning, again, is to create helpless victims on one side, or at least people who perceive themselves that way. They make easy political fodder and great foot soldiers for violence, then to set up a target on the other side, the West. By contrast, when I personally speak or train on topics pertaining to human development and personal talent in my capacity as a professional speaker and author, I cite discipline as the leading indicator of success. I am not alone among human development specialists in arriving at this conclusion. Discipline is the strong arm of personal accountability, which is at the very root of all personal success. I train the notion of what I call preloaded discipline, arguing that good decisions and excellent performance happen in advance of the moment. Don't follow your heart, which is capricious, injudicious, and biased toward easy pleasure. Instead, make the best decision before the time, then determine the outcome in advance by preloading discipline. This technique is critical in raising children who are able to resist drugs. Drugs are rarely ever presented by a dark and hostile man in a trench coat, inviting a child to conspire to do evil in an alleyway. Instead, they are presented as easy and fun, usually in settings perceived to be quite safe and usually by their good friends. A decision made by the heart will lead a child straight into participation. A principled decision made in advance can ward off all manner of problems because the discipline to live up to the decision has been preloaded. The child sees it coming and knows what to do. 11. To be more inclusive, we have to get rid of the wrong kind of people. The originator and champion of this stunningly warped idea was Herbert Marcuse, a German-born US intellectual who had a great and lasting effect on Western educational ideas. Marcuse was heralded as the father of the modern left, which should tell you everything you need to know. He originally represented his idea as repressive tolerance. His argument goes like this: an all-embracing tolerance ends up legitimizing an unfair status quo. This is code for, if you let good ideas be debated long enough, the best ones win, and that's unfair for the bad ones. Marcuse then proposed that the best form of tolerance is intolerance of anything that is intolerant to everything else. That sounds complex and confusing. Simply stated, Marcuse wants us to accept everything that accepts everything. He also wants us to deny and exclude anything that doesn't accept anything. In practical terms, if science disconfirms Islam or feminist theory, it is science that must go because it is being exclusionary. Marcuse went on to recommend that educators should actually avoid ever even engaging with mainstream ideas, on the grounds that they were now so ideologically embedded, which is code for so thoroughly argued, debated, vetted, and refined over the centuries as to be considered correct. Instead, he proposed that educators should only engage with the troubling and radical ideas. Translation, please? Why, certainly. Ignore accepted Western tradition. Dismiss it wholesale. Think about radical ideas only. If you wonder why a modern school seems to completely ignore entire categories such as science, democracy, Judeo-Christian moral frameworks, and every other major institution that has formed the bedrock of our society for 2 millennia and, instead, only seems to discuss themes like radical feminist theory and Marxism, well, that's why. Marcuse taught them to do so. 12. Walls are symbols of hate. Here is an example of how the politically correct left has successfully used propaganda to create a public narrative. They are adept at claiming words like kindness as uniquely theirs. In the nationality debate, they have largely succeeded at creating the narrative that walls represent hate. They do not. In the most basic sense, walls represent care. A wall is created first and foremost to protect that which we value. That is the entire point of a wall, to keep out a threat. In the broader sense of a national debate, to assert that a nation may not have a wall is also to assert that it may not have national sovereignty. And when did the left win that debate? The left likes to use the example of the Berlin Wall. The flaw in this argument is obvious. This Soviet construction was designed to keep its own people in. The guns were faced toward their own citizens. This is the diametric opposite of a wall designed to keep people safe from outside intrusion. Absent borders and walls, where are the boundaries inscribing a community that has agreed to practices like democracy or rule of law? Absent such borders, who is in charge? And what belief system, legal system, political system do they employ? Walls and borders not only protect that which we value, they demarcate a community of people practicing high standards of law, belief, or politics. They are the delineation of our place. The left also argues that walls represent nationalism, which was practiced by Nazis. Yet nationalism was also practiced by the Allied nations, Britain and America, who defeated the Nazis in defense of their nations. The argument that nationalism equals Nazism is absurd. Walls are love, not hate. They represent value and protection, not aggression. Nationalism is morally neutral, but can be used for moral good or evil. Protecting your borders does not qualify as moral evil in the same way that trying to expand them might. Nevertheless, here we see how the progressive left is anti-nationalism and pro-globalization. 13. Islam is a religion of peace. The West has a short memory. In its relatively brief 1,500-year history, Islam very nearly conquered Europe. It is numerically the bloodiest religion the world has seen, though its body count still lags way behind that of socialism, and its unyielding tenets of intolerance toward all other belief systems, including liberal democracy, is baked into its DNA. It is also culturally intolerant. If one enjoys the color, music, pageantry, and unique dress that comprise the wonderfully varied cultural expression of human groups around the world, it is positively depressing to see their subjugation into uniform, black-clothed drabness under Islamic repression. Liberals eagerly and regularly present Judeo-Christian beliefs and Islam as equivalent. There is no equivalence between them, and it is important to be able to qualify the differences. For now, here is just one example, based on the names. In the Old Testament, Jacob, one of the patriarchs of the Israelites, is renamed Israel, which means struggle with God. And Jacob Israel did struggle with God, even to the point of negotiating outcomes with the deity. Jews take this as a precedent. It is an open invitation to debate, struggle, argue, and haggle with God. The result is that theirs has always been a religion and culture of lively debate and ongoing literary thought and meaningful negotiation. By contrast, Islam means the exact opposite. The word means submission. This is not a religion that welcomes debating with God or haggling over ideas. It prescribes only compliance at the threat of death. It is the difference between lively thought versus thoughtless obedience. And that is merely the starting point for each respective faith. The differences grow ever starker as the edifices of each construct mature from these foundations. Of the various belief systems that the West defeated in their own spheres, such as paganism, communism, and Islam, which are now being welcomed back into the public arena by progressive liberals, Islam is perhaps the one most starkly at odds with their own goals and views. Nevertheless, conflation of Western religion with Islam is a common tactic by progressives, as in the viral YouTube video by a feminist railing against traditional marriage. She mentions the human rights abuses of forced marriage and child brides. In this, I agree with her, and I strongly recommend she begin campaigning against these things in the Middle East. 14. He is literally Hitler. Few people on earth have ever faced the modern-day Hitler accusation as often or vehemently as US President Donald Trump when he came to office in 2016. However, it is interesting to note that the facile hurling of this moniker is nothing new. In his excellent biography of Ronald Reagan and the fall of communism, Paul Kenger notes with wry amusement how liberal Democrats used precisely the same accusations against Reagan. They then repeated the narrative against Bush, then Trump. Democrats have spoken about impeaching every single conservative president since Eisenhower. Calling conservatives Nazis and threatening to impeach presidents is standard operating procedure for liberals. It is just what they do. Should conservatives shoulder the blame for Nazism? Hardly. As we have seen, Nazism and communism are two revolutionary, read progressive, not conservative, ideologies that arose directly from progressive social theories on the left. Both are responsible for mass murder. Conservative Westerners, predominantly Christians, overthrew them both. The conservative approach to progress is slow and peaceful. The leftist approach to progress is revolutionary and, if necessary, violent. The man who founded the first modern democracy on earth was conservative Christian George Washington. The man who led the overthrow of slavery in the US was conservative Christian President Abraham Lincoln. The man who led the fight against Nazism and communism was conservative Christian Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And the man who finally overthrew the communist Soviet Union was conservative Christian Ronald Reagan. If you truly want liberty, if you genuinely want to face down and defeat tyranny, if your goal is to abolish slavery, it would appear that what you need are conservative Christians in positions of leadership. Now there's a politically incorrect thing to say. Still, it is demonstrably true, and we should repeat it loudly and often. Despite this, as Jonah Goldberg observes in Liberal Fascism, the New York Times leads a long roster of mainstream publications eager to promote leading academics who raise the possibility that the GOP is a fascist party and that Christian conservatives are the new Nazis. The word perverse does not capture it. 15. The world was a utopia of peaceful ethnic tribes. Then white people from Europe came along and conquered everyone. They took their cities and their wealth. White people, they're the real problem. History is infinitely more complex and more nuanced than this simplistic representation would suggest. Every nation has had slavery. There has not been a place or culture in human history that was free of humans selling other humans into bondage. Historians record that North Africa's Barbary Coast pirates captured and enslaved over 1 million Europeans in the period between 1500 and 1800. This actually represents more Europeans brought in bondage to Africa than there were Africans brought to the United States. Whoever tells that story? Yet it happened, and it happened to over 1 million white Western Europeans. This does not even count Europeans being bought and sold in the Islamic Middle East. Or we might ask why North America becomes the target of focus for revisionist slavery narratives, when Brazil in South America imported more slaves from Africa than did the whole of the Northern American territories combined. One might argue that America is highlighted because it is especially racist against black people in favor of white people. But really? There are Americans still alive today who will remember discrimination against the Irish. Again, history is more complicated than the caricature we receive from sociologists with a vested interest in slanted narratives, designed not to recount truthful history, but to attack the old order. So, the fact of the matter is that the West has been a committer of slavery, and the West has been a victim of slavery. That is genuine history, replete with good and bad people in every culture. Historical fact remains unmoved by modern liberal interpretations. It just is. And that is how we should study it, warts and all, if we hope to learn from it. Tell the truth. Nevertheless, there is one more pertinent fact about history that just is. The fact is, the West was the first to ban slavery. Similarly, the West was the first to extend full legal and contractual rights to women, a phenomenon still unmatched in many Middle Eastern nations today. The West's own historical slavery numbers, though appalling, do not reach the numbers achieved by Islamic nations. And as the West evolved, it could no longer morally accommodate the institution of slavery and banned it everywhere. Islamic countries were practicing slavery openly into the 1960s and 1970s, and the practice continues to this day, though not legally. In many of these nations, women still do not enjoy the right to enter into contracts as free individuals, nor do they enjoy equal standing before the law. In the peaceful pre-Western utopia narrative, we are also not told about cultural inconveniences, such as the Aztec practice of sacrificing people from other tribes. How many? Scholars estimate these acts of human sacrifice occurred at a rate of some 20,000 per year. That continued right up to the Spanish arrival in the Americas. Nor is it ever mentioned that colonization is not a uniquely Western idea, not even close. Clans, tribes, nations, and cultures have been conquering and colonizing one another since the dawn of recorded history. Quite aside from Islamic slavery, there was Islamic colonialism, the Islamic expansion, which took place over hundreds of years, destroyed untold numbers of local ethnic cultures, and colonized millions of people. Nor is it stated that in many cases the white Western colonizers were escaping oppression in their own lands, and that is why many of them departed for distant shores. Does this excuse crimes against humanity committed by the West? Not at all. The West is acutely aware of its crimes. But what is disingenuous is the assertion that only the West has a violent past. It simply isn't true. Another simplistic narrative is that science and Christianity have always been mortal enemies. Even the most cursory look at what actually transpired utterly dispels this notion. The best book on the subject, What's So Great About Christianity, by Dinesh D'Souza. 16. What she does with her body is her business. Strangest among the liberal narratives is the idea that those who object to abortion are somehow oppressing women. There are two things for which this notion fails to account. As a man, I gain nothing by objecting to a woman having an abortion. I do not gain power over her, I do not gain sexual favor from her, and I do not gain submission from her. There is no benefit to me in opposing abortion. If anything, I would gain freer, easier sex by championing it. And secondly, the interests I am championing are those of a third party and not my own. If I am successful in opposing abortion, a child survives. This is not my child. Statistically, most often, this is a black female child whose rights I am attempting to uphold. I might also add that it is harder to oppose abortion publicly than simply not to do so. By doing nothing, I would not face opposition. Hence the oppressive patriarchy narrative is absurd. It also tacitly assumes a couple of additional flaws. That other women do not oppose abortion. They do. And that men may not speak on a moral issue insofar as it pertains to females. They can. Once again, this is an attempt at deplatforming by obfuscation. It doesn't work if you say it doesn't work. Morality does not get subsumed under gender issues. If that were the case, then women should be forbidden from speaking against male crime. They are not, and rightly so. 17. The problem is not the problem. It's the stigma that matters. I grew up in Africa at the time when AIDS rose to prominence in the public consciousness. Even as a teenager who did not yet comprehend the oddities of political correctness, I was baffled by the liberal ANC government's response to AIDS. In public health pamphlets and television advertisements, they attacked the stigma of AIDS. The real problem, it seemed, was not the virus itself, nor the behaviors that transferred it. The real problem was the public stigma surrounding it. Having subsequently studied the messaging created by gay advocacy groups, I now understand why this was done. AIDS was a big threat to the normalization of homosexuality. That was the agenda. I recall reading with astonishment the advice given to young people in these AIDS awareness publications, such as, "Some people are lucky enough to be bisexual. This means you can enjoy having meaningful sex with people of both genders." This was the advice that followed on the heels of how important it was to get rid of stigma. This was supposedly life-saving information for the AIDS generation in Africa. Perhaps it was my adolescent level of reasoning, but it seemed to me that guiding people away from behaviors that caused their death might have been more important than sparing their feelings, or championing free love. Here is another example of the stigma problem. On July 2nd, 2019, Dr. Drew Pinsky stated on Fox News, "Because we made drugs legal, essentially in California, the drug users are here now because they don't get hassled. California's homeless and drug problems have been skyrocketing of late because the state successfully overcame the stigma of homelessness and drug use. The obvious outcomes were more homelessness and drug use." Who could possibly have guessed? This seems obvious to the conservative mind. The liberal mind can't seem to see it. Prioritizing stigma over problem is, in fact, a representative microcosm of the liberal mindset. Immorality, harm, deadly viruses, none of these are as important as hurt feelings about the subject. In this modality of thinking, don't judge becomes more important than saving lives. I utterly reject it, and you should too. Debate tip. One of the most common liberal techniques for shutting down an argument is the simplistic directive, "You're not allowed to judge." Your response, "Yes, I am." Sometimes the best counterargument is simple assertion. Nevertheless, when the argument inevitably proceeds, respond with, "Why not?" Judgment forms the basis of justice. Are you saying that we should not base our society on concepts of justice? The likely response to this is a trick often used against Christians. The Bible says you're not allowed to judge. Your response, "Nope, it says to judge with righteousness. Go check John 7 verse 24. While you're at it, 1 Corinthians 6 verse 2 says that saints will judge all the world." The likely response to that is, "Well, I don't think you should judge." To which you can reply, "That's nice." 18. We need to address your toxic masculinity. Let us begin with an honest admission. Most wars and most violent crimes are committed by men. Of that there is no dispute. We do not practice reverse political correctness by pretending this away. The politically correct incarnation of this idea, however, has nothing to do with these realities. Toxic masculinity is a different charge entirely. How can we know this? Because in the most violent cities in the United States, for example, Chicago, violent crime is disproportionately committed by black males. Yet, under political correctness, these very males are seen as the victims of circumstance, specifically poverty. No, the demonization of men is premised on something more intrinsic, their very maleness. Qualities deemed to be quintessentially masculine become objects of scorn. The perfectly natural and even gentlemanly compulsions to be helpful and to get things done are portrayed perversely as acts that show male strength and dominance over females, or as mansplaining. If a man sits with his legs apart, biologically more comfortable given important anatomical differences, he is accused of manspreading. If he does anything whatsoever that attempts to uphold his own dignity or to represent him in a favorable light, as women also do, and as all human beings do, then we are immediately told about the fragility of the male ego. This is pure sexism. The left knows this and attempts to justify it with a trick. They pull the same trick with racism. They attempt to incorporate the power dynamic into the definition. It's not racism, and it's not sexism, if you are attacking those in power. Their theory is often stated like this: racism equals prejudice plus power. On that basis, a black person who hates white people is not racist. Clever, right? This new tactic of theirs proceeds from feminist theory. It can only work if you fail to notice or to point out their ideologically embedded definitions of racism or sexism. Thus, it is disingenuous. It is also a blatant example of self-serving propaganda. You do not get to change terms and definitions to suit your worldview. That is the same as rigging a debate so that you will win. There are many additional truisms presented as part and parcel of the demonization of males package. The term rape culture proceeds from this propaganda too. This last must not be taken lightly. In nations like Sweden or South Africa, Citizens face some of the highest global statistics of male-on-female rape. In South Africa, most sources agree on 1 in 3, and by some accounts, 1 in 2. These numbers are atrocious and outperform many war zones in their horror. For that reason, we might legitimately claim the existence of a rape culture in such a nation. In the United States, from which the term proceeds, the numbers presented by feminists and those who demonize men are simply untrue. The term rape culture is applied primarily to U.S. universities, where it is alleged that 1 in 4 women are raped. FBI statistics reveal that the actual percentage of women raped on campus is 0.6%. There is another pernicious element to the rape culture notion, and that is what the terminology implies. It implies that men have a networked interest in supporting, aiding, and protecting other men who rape. Here I turn this one to you as a personal question. Has it been your experience that the men you meet want to help rapists? Or has it been your experience that men are generally violently antagonistic toward rapists? Implied in this term, culture, is a reality that I do not see supported by real-world experience. Contrary to feminist assertion, most men do not hate women, but most men do, in fact, abhor rapists. The war on men ranges from the grave to the petty, from allegations of a culture of rape and a society-dominating patriarchy, to the petty grievances of manspreading, fart rape. I kid you not, this is the feminist idea that a man's assertive breaking of wind is done to prove his dominance and to force a woman into submission. And even wrong face. Remember the Covington kid who made global headlines for looking smug in the face of a Native American protester, and how it all went quiet after it was proved that the young man was actually the victim. The hatred for him was global and palpable. Why? We will explore the ways to untangle this mess and answer coherently. Yet, by far, the best response to anti-maleness is the most visceral. It is society's lived experiences of good, strong men. Nothing defeats feminist propaganda like well-treated women who observe, "It just isn't so." To this end, anti-PC women can do much good by speaking out and not allowing the poison to propagate against the men they cherish. We are grateful when you do. 19. Capitalism is exploitation. The rich take from the poor. I have written 2 books on personal wealth, Is Your Thinking Keeping You Poor? And Poverty Proof. In both cases, I had to explain to the reader up front that there are 2 sets of answers to poverty: the politically correct, kind-sounding, but untrue, and the difficult-to-hear, but valid. No other area of life contains as much misleading leftist propaganda as does money. From Karl Marx onward, the left have despised the rich and have employed every form of lie, deceit, and conflict-inducing con to discredit them. For my money, the ugliest and most violence-generating belief from the left is this: wealth exists and must be distributed. Every evil book on money has followed this formula, from the writings of Marx and Lenin to the 21st Century Update, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. The reality, and it is a terrifically important distinction, actually goes like this: wealth does not exist, it is generated. I call their flawed idea the finite pool fallacy. It assumes that all wealth pre-existed in one finite pool. Since then, we've merely discovered it, and we've been divvying it up, unfairly as it turns out. But wealth does not pre-exist. It is not a finite pool. Instead, it is a constantly growing wellspring, generated through work and innovation that create value. And that fact matters greatly. It determines whether systems of wealth must be predicated on stealing what others have generated, or on teaching others how to generate for themselves. The latter system is the most successful idea in all of human history, with the most dramatic and demonstrable results. The former idea is the most failed idea in history, with the biggest body count of any ideology. Building on this flawed point, the left will also imply that colonialists arrived on foreign shores and took the wealth. When left unchecked, they will even talk about stealing cities. In almost all cases, these cities didn't exist, and the pioneers subsequently built their wealth. This difference in understanding between wealth merely existing or being actively generated is the essential point of departure between the left and right economically. Here's another. Complete the sentence for me. The rich are getting richer and... You said it, didn't you? You've heard it hundreds of times. Do you believe it? It is not true. Over the past 100 years, Western capitalist practices have lifted more people out of poverty, both as a number and as a percentage of humanity, than ever before in all of human history. In the past 20 years alone, prior to the systemic shock of the coronavirus crisis, over 1 billion people had escaped extreme poverty. Extreme poverty had been very nearly eradicated from the face of the earth. These days, where it is to be found, it is the almost exclusive domain of tyrannical governments, socialist societies like Venezuela, which used to be the wealthiest country in South America under its previous capitalist system, or gang and drug-ravaged failed states. In many cases, where capitalism was interrupted by the COVID-19 crisis, it's back. The poor are not getting poorer. Indeed, the poor are getting much, much, much richer. The past 100 years have constituted nothing short of an economic miracle, and the credit goes squarely to free trade capitalism. Still, the leftist narrative prevails. The greedy rich are constantly stealing from the oppressed poor. To change all that, all we have to do is redistribute, read steal, their wealth. Interesting to note, where liberals are faced with insurmountable arguments in favor of capitalism and against socialism, they will often change motivations for their argument. They will switch to how capitalism destroys the environment, then begin their anti-capitalist crusade all over again. Our theory may not make economic sense, and yours might, but yours destroys the earth. Objection. Even the Bible says that money is the root of all evil. Response. That's not even close. The verse actually reads, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. 1 Timothy 6 verse 10. Useful term. In response to the left's attack on trickle-down theory, you can correctly position them as advocates for trickle-up poverty. 20. There's no media bias. Almost all of the leading mainstream media display a left-leaning bias. This bias isn't merely limited to the editorial pages or talk shows. Even the supposedly hard-nosed economic and financial journalists in major outlets like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Associated Press are overwhelmingly liberal. Researchers from Arizona State University and Texas A&M surveyed 462 financial journalists and found a ratio of 13 liberals for every 1 conservative. The report goes on to ask, whatever happened to ideological diversity? They observe, you might want to take it, they're reporting, with a grain of salt. That's especially true if the piece seems unduly harsh on the free market system and its many proven benefits, or if it lauds socialism as an answer to society's ills. Also from investors.com, we read, the fact is Google, YouTube, and Facebook all have shown repeated bias against conservative voices and websites. Google, for instance, used to attach fact checks on conservative stories from leftist sites. It also tilted the results of searches towards left-wing politicians over conservatives. It even fired a computer tech, James Damore, merely for expressing a non-left opinion over the male-female wage gap. Worse still, YouTube, a lucrative utility for many sites that seek to make money from their web presence, has demonetized conservative sites such as Prager University, whose informative and thought-provoking videos have nothing whatsoever to do with alt-right anything. Recent videos include such fare as Why America Must Lead and Why Did America Fight the Korean War? For this, PragerU was kept from having ads on its videos. Facebook, along with the rest of the far-left mainstream media, routinely shuns conservative stories on its news sites and aggressively limited partisan sites it doesn't like. All of them work with the Southern Poverty Law Center, a far-left group that aggressively declares right-of-center organizations as hate groups. None of the major web giants, to our knowledge, works with a comparable conservative group such as, say, David Horowitz's Freedom Center. Naturally, big advertisers seem to love their social justice causes too. We think of Nike supporting Colin Kaepernick kneeling before the US flag, or Gillette beginning with their infamous advertisements on toxic masculinity, then progressing to the even worse trans man's first shave ad. To point out what is wrong with just one of these ads, take Kaepernick. His protest is against disproportionate killing of black people by US police. Studies conclusively prove this fact to be utterly false. Kaepernick, a black man, was himself raised by two white parents who adopted him and gave him every privilege, resulting in his selection to play in the National Football League and become rich and famous. He is a multimillionaire sports star, posing as an oppressed victim, perpetuating a narrative that has been falsified. Nike is playing off this narrative in order to make money. It has no ethical qualms about victimizing police officers through false accusation as part of its commercial policy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I have never bought another pair of Nike sneakers. At the last tally, Nike had lost $3.75 billion in market capital after Kaepernick was named the face of Just Do It. 21. Advocacy for big government. One world. In many ways, this is what it all comes down to. All leftism, all socialism, all political correctness must ultimately achieve its end goal. And that goal is big, centralized government. Global government, if possible. The entire project is designed to put power into the hands of a few. Leftists do not see the danger in this. They do not even see the irony in their liberal efforts to create a big, new, centralized ruler with all the power to dictate the norms of society, including how we think, speak, act, earn, and spend. Instead, Hobbes's Leviathan seems like a jolly good idea to them. And, where we oppose it, they call us oppressors. They comfort themselves with the idea that big government will lead us all to utopia. Peace. The end of history. While they are at it, these unquestioned rulers will solve climate change and end war. They will make everyone equal. If they have to shut down some liberties along the way, that's a small price to pay. If they must teach our children that there is no God, then so be it. And if they're forced to get rid of a few undesirable dissidents, well, that's a small price to pay for heaven on earth. And that, my friend, is why we fight.